My name is Sarah Barron. I'm the Dean of the Library. Welcome to Regent University and welcome to our library. Welcome to the Living Word Speaker Series. I'm delighted today to introduce you to Dr. Archie Wright, who's going to be speaking on the topic Introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. Wright is an associate professor of biblical studies here at Regent University in our School of Divinity. He has a PhD from the University of Durham, a master's and bachelor's from Oral Roberts University. He recently edited a book called Spirit and Scripture, Exploring a Pneumatic Hermeneutic. I don't think he's going to explain to us what those words mean today, but he will tell us about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Archie Wright.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I was telling Sarah, this takes me back to my teaching my undergraduate days at Oral Roberts, where there was 75 or 100 people in the classroom, whereas here at Regent in Divinity, we have 20 average, probably. So this is going to be interesting having this many people here. But hopefully it'll be fun for everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about the Dead Sea Scrolls. How many have any idea what they are? Oh, good. So I'm not talking to blank slates. That's good. This is an area of study of mine that I did in my dissertation work and have since carried on since then. So it's a passion of mine, particularly when it comes to tracing out traditions from the Hebrew Bible through the Second Temple period and on into the New Testament, which I will raise a couple of those points today when we're talking about the scrolls. So why the scrolls? Well, with the green collection here today, there are several facsimiles on display, and I'll just name them for you so you have an idea of what you should be looking for when you go over there. The Great Isaiah Scroll, which is a text dating from the 2nd century BC, which predates our previous Hebrew texts by about 11 or 1200 years. So you can tell how important these documents are based on that. Then we also have 1QS, which is called the Manual of Discipline or the Rule of the Community, which talks about how people are supposed to live within the Qumran community, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. We also have one of the examples of what's called a pesher, which is a commentary on biblical texts, and the one we have here today is the Pesher to Habakkuk, which is really interesting. It's a line-by-line commentary on the first two books of the book of Habakkuk from the Old Testament. Then we also have some fragments of Kohelet, which are wisdom texts from Ecclesiastes. Then we also have another Pesher called the Pesher Isaiah, which goes through the book of Isaiah and gives a line-by-line commentary on the book of Isaiah in its relation to the Qumran community itself and how they all fit, how that text fits into their world in the 2nd or 1st century BC. And then finally we have the Genesis Apocryphon, which is another facsimile here from the 2nd century BC, which is basically a rewritten Bible text of the book of Genesis, or portions of it anyway, let's put it that way. So those are 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are on display here, and they're all very interesting, all very important texts in relation to how we can understand our New Testament and how we can understand the 1st century of the Common Era, where Jesus emerged onto the scene of world history. These texts tell us a lot about the worldview and the theology of at least the Qumran community, and probably some about the broader Jewish community within Palestine, and a little bit about some of the outlying areas, because some of the texts that are at Qumran from the Dead Sea Scrolls are not necessarily from Qumran, but they are also from areas outside, from Syria, probably Babylon, what would be today modern Lebanon, and perhaps even Egypt. So there's a variety of stuff here, but there's also a lot of texts that were actually written at Qumran by what we consider to be called the Essenes. These were what everybody seems to think were the residents of Qumran, although there are some who would disagree with that speculation. So let's get started. In 1947, as the story goes, there were two Bedouin sheep herders, goat herders, who stumbled across what would probably be, at least I would consider, and most people in this field of study, would be the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century, if not in all of biblical history. What we discovered from the scrolls was a blank area previous to this. We had some pseudepigrapha, for instance, 1 Enoch, Jubilees, but those texts that we have were from much later, probably beginning in the 9th, 10th centuries of the Common Era. But now we have texts that are dated from the 2nd, 1st, even the 3rd century BC, and also from the 1st century CE. So you can see how relevant they are in looking at Christianity and the emergence of Christianity in the 1st century CE. But at the same time, these texts are very important how we look at them in relation to how they stood in Judaism by themselves. We can't look at them only for their relationship to Christianity, but it tells us much, much more about Judaism that we didn't know in what used to be called the intertestamental period, which is a misnomer, or the 400 years of silence. You've probably heard that phrase before in some of your church days or class days. While searching for one of their lost goats, these two shepherds, one of the men threw a stone into a cave that was along the hillside at the Dead Sea Scroll in hopes of hearing the goat, because I guess goats go in there and get out of the rain or shelter or whatever. But instead he heard the breaking of what would be discovered to be one of the clay pots in which some of the scrolls were stored in. This would be in Cave 1. Of course, that makes sense, right? This is the first cave they go to, so we named it Cave 1. And we go all the way through Cave 11, which we'll talk about along the way. But more on the shepherds in a moment. So the discovery and the eventual publication of the scrolls would open up a window into life and particularly religious thought during the Second Temple period. Does everybody know what I'm talking about with Second Temple period? Second Temple period runs from the post-exilic emergence out of Babylon and the rebuilding of the temple, the Second Temple, all the way through to probably 70 CE is the most accurate date when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. So that's roughly the period of the Second Temple period. And this is where the scrolls were brought together at Qumran, and some of them written by the occupants of Qumran and some of them written by other Jews outside of the Qumran community in the diaspora of Judaism. So as a result of this discovery, we have a new tool that's suddenly made available by which to examine first century Jewish world from which Christianity would emerge. And the scrolls offer an understanding of the theological views, although they are quite sectarian. Okay, remember Qumran and the Essenes were considered a sect. Although when you talk about sects in Judaism, there's roughly 20 different sects within Judaism in the first century of the Common Era. So they weren't that much standing on their own, or that in other words, they didn't have all these very odd, peculiar views. Their views were very much in line with the rest of Judaism, although there are some very distinct features, particularly in 1QS, the Manual of Discipline, on how they're supposed to live in community, which I think we could probably learn a little bit from that. And the scrolls offer an understanding of the theological views, which includes issues such as eschatology or messianism, which for us today seem to be two very important issues as far as Christianity is concerned. But one of the more important things about the discovery of the scrolls is the bringing together of Jewish and Christian scholars, something that wasn't done too much prior to this. Some of the first to do it were Dr. David Flusser, who was a rabbinic scholar at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and a Christian Baptist minister, gosh, his name's slipping my mind right now, sorry. Robert Lindsay, sorry. He was a Baptist minister in Jerusalem during the time of the discovery of the scrolls in the late 40s, early 50s. And David Flusser and Bob Lindsay got together and started working on the scrolls and the Gospels. So we have a very ultra-Orthodox Jewish rabbi, David Flusser, working with a Baptist minister, Baptist missionary, trying to see how these texts help us understand what was going on with the Gospels, or how the Gospels were emerging during the first century. So very important work going on. So back to the caves. The caves are along the shores of the Dead Sea, which we'll talk about its physical characteristics in a minute. In what was then Jordan territory. It wasn't Israel, and some will argue it's still not Israel, but that's besides the point. It's now modern Israel. The site of the discovery became known as Qumran, and there's several reasons for that. It's located south of modern Jericho. How many of you have been to Israel? Know what I'm talking about here? A little bit, a couple of you. And halfway down the Dead Sea towards the Herodian mountain fortress or palace of Masada, which is an amazing site. If you ever get to go to Israel, make sure you go to Masada. It's an amazing place. Here's a map. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. The Dead Sea, and you notice Jerusalem, of course, the capital of Israel, and Jericho. This is the ancient city of Jericho. Now, to give you a little perspective of distance here, from Jerusalem to Jericho is only about 25 miles, okay? And then Jericho to Qumran, which you see right below the name Jericho, is about 20 miles. So you can see there's not a lot of distance between the capital of Jerusalem and the Qumran community. Although the crazy thing is this territory or this terrain here is nothing but desolate rocks, dirt, and there's a drop of 1,200 feet from Jerusalem. Actually, it would be farther down from Jerusalem, down to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community. This slide in particular has two photos on it. One on the left is from the 1960s, and this gives you an aerial view of the community itself, where the people would have lived in the closing centuries BC and the first century CE, up until the destruction by the Romans. After the Romans destroyed the temple, they came down through the Dead Sea Valley and attacked Qumran, and then went on down to Masada. And I don't know if you know the story of Masada and the death of the rebels there, but it's really interesting. But the Romans then went on down to Masada, and took 2 years to finally conquer that fortress because of the height of the fortress itself and the difficulty of getting to the top. Just keep in mind, this is very desolate terrain and would not have been easily traversed in the period which the location was populated. The Dead Sea itself is the lowest point on the earth. It's roughly 49 miles long and 11 miles wide, so it's not a huge lake, but it's big. It sits roughly 1,200 feet below sea level, with average temperatures reaching 55 degrees in the winter, and then 115 degrees plus in the summer. And these temperatures, although they sound really extreme, we can be thankful for these temperatures and the extremely low humidity, which was roughly 31% today. So we don't really know for sure what it was back in the first century. But and these are key factors that played in preserving these scrolls for some 2,000 years. So without this climate at the Dead Sea, we probably wouldn't be talking about these things today. let's see. Slide 5 here provides a view of the cave clusters, which is in the front of the photo here. I wish I had a pointer, but you can see the community in the background. And then towards the front of the photo in this jut, looks like a finger coming out. This is where caves 4 through 10 were located. And cave 4 is probably the most significant cave out of all the 11 at Qumran, which we'll talk about in a minute. The soft nature of the limestone has resulted in very quick erosion of several caves in this particular area and this finger. In fact, Roland DeVoe, who was the lead archaeologist for the site in the 60s, intentionally collapsed the roof of Cave 8 for safety's sake in order to go in there and then excavate what fragments were hidden in the cave. So, and you can, if you go there today, you can see a lot of this stuff is gone from the finger. It's just wearing away so quickly. There's not going to be much left of any of the caves probably in another 50 years. So if you want to go see them, get on a plane and go. All right, back to the discovery. Here's our two friends again. 1947, I don't know if you know much about the history of the period. There was a British and UN mandate had just been issued to partition the land of Palestine into a Jewish state, which would be Israel, and a Palestinian state. From this mandate, the state of Israel will be established in 1948. Here we have our two friends standing outside of Cave 1. This is a photo from the 1950s. So you can see at that point how small it is. And we'll see in a moment how much it has eroded also. We're told of various reports of the beginning of the saga of the scrolls originating with three young cousins from the Ta'amire Bedouin tribe who traditionally kept their flocks along the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, which was then the kingdom of Jordan, not Israel. While searching for their goats, one of the cousins, Juma Muhammad Khalil, threw a stone into the caves in the hope of finding them. And it's reported that Muhammad, the youngest of the three cousins, entered into the cave a few days later and discovered 10 clay jars. This was the first discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All but 2 were empty. This is what we know now in a way. If this is true, and there's a reason for them being empty, we believe that they were probably robbed at some point. There's a gap between this initial discovery and then the opening of the cave following the 1948 war between Israel and the Arab states. So if this is true and the caves were robbed, it suggests to us that there's a great deal more scroll material in the possession of someone in the world, but we don't know exactly who. So I know of one fragment of a scroll that somebody put on offer about 2 years ago from the book of 1 Enoch. And they wanted $3 million for it. And of course, nobody's taken up that offer yet. But it tells us that there are more fragments or documents out there that people are holding in private collections. Right now, the majority of the scrolls are under the jurisdiction of the Israel Museum or the Israel Antiquities Authority. They're the ones who possess the scrolls, and any permissions for publication or showing in public had to come from them, which you'll see here in a moment. I have a photo of several of the scrolls. So here's the interior of Cave 1. This is the first scroll cave that the Bedouins would have entered into and found their 10 clay jars, 2 of them having some scroll material in them. You can see there's not much there, and it looked like it'd be a good place for a goat to hide. I don't know if I was a goat, I'd be in there hiding. Get out of the heat. Remember, it's 115, 120 degrees there during the summer. And then at night, I lived in Israel for about 3 years, and at night, during the day it'd be 115 degrees, and then at night it dropped down to about 55 or 60. So you can see that you have a 50-degree swing in temperature within 5 or 6 hours. It's been recounted that Muhammad found 3 bundles of wrapped scrolls within the pots. 2 of the bundles were wrapped in cloth, and another was a leather scroll. And the accounts claim that they only removed these 3 scrolls that day and left others there, which I don't know why they would do that, but well. It's presumed by scholars that the large leather scroll was the great Isaiah scroll, and that the other 2 scrolls were the Habakkuk Pesher, which we mentioned earlier, 1QPH, and the Community Rule, 1QS. Sources claim the 3 bundles were taken to the Bedouin camp near Bethlehem and apparently left hanging on a tent pole for several weeks. Probably used some of it to start fires with too, but of course not knowing the value of them. And as a result, some damage occurred to the scrolls. But eventually the 2 older cousins brought the scrolls to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem, Ibrahim Ija, in March of 1947. So there's the initial part of the story. Oh, sorry, I should have been clicking along here. This slide contains the image of the Pesher, commentary on the book of Habakkuk. This we have a facsimile of over in the display area. This is a line-by-line commentary on the biblical book of Habakkuk. And the image provided here by the Israeli Museum of Jerusalem, this particular image shows columns 12 and 13, which reveal a change in the scribal hand or the writing between the top portion of column 12 and then the bottom portion of the column 12 and then the column 13. It may be difficult for you to see from there, but there definitely is a change of who was writing this scroll from the beginning of column 12, taking up in the bottom 5 or 6 lines of that column and then over into column 13. So there's two people were writing this scroll, at least. 2 different scribes were writing the scroll. Or this may be a copy of an original scroll. We're not really sure exactly how that works. The next slide is of 1QS. This is the rule of the community. This particular scroll, if you wanted to get into Qumran, if you wanted to become a member of Qumran, this is how you would get in. They would tell you, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And then upon initial entry, or it would take 2 years to become a full member of the community. Upon initial entry, you had to hand over all your worldly goods to the community. Food, money, everything. And you would live as a community, and everything would come to you through the community, whether it be food or provisions, anything like that. It was a community life that required you to fully commit to it. So it was really interesting from that point of view, from what we learned from this scroll. The next slide is the great Isaiah scroll. And this is a huge scroll. It's the only complete version of Isaiah that we have from this period of time. Remember, this predates the original Hebrew text from the Masoretic text by probably 11 or 1200 years. So it really takes us back. And yes, there are differences between this version of Isaiah and the version that we now have in our Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. There are some differences. But there are also some differences between this particular text and also the Greek Septuagint. If you were here to listen to Dr. Spahn yesterday, he went into some great detail about how the traditions of the Septuagint are brought down from the Old Testament into the Hebrew Bible. So we can learn a lot about copying, paleography from this text, but we can also learn a lot about how some traditions were evolving, how scribes were involved in copying text? Did they happen to add some of their own little commentary to it? Some interesting things when you look at this in comparison to the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible that we have now. There are some interesting bits of difference. So back to the discovery. The antiquities dealer Isha suspected the scrolls were stolen from a synagogue and returned them to the men, saying there were no archaeological value. Duh. The nice thing is they weren't deterred by this. The two shepherds took them to another dealer who sent them to a member of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. Archbishop Samuel of the church thought they were of great value and agreed to buy them. And it's likely that the dealer returned to the cave with the two Bedouin and brought out 4 more scrolls, which we'll talk about here in a second. And one of these scrolls was left with the dealer, the Genesis Apocryphon text, which we have a facsimile of part of it over in the display area. The 3 others were kept by the Bedouin. Thanksgiving hymns, 1 QH, and then the War Scroll, 1 QM. But we don't know the identity of the 4th one at this point. But there were 4 scrolls brought out, but 1 was left with the dealer, and the Bedouin kept 2 of them, but we don't know what happened to the 4th one. Or we don't know what it was, let's put it that way. Here's the crazy thing. They later sold them for $28 to another antiquities dealer, which I don't think you could buy these 4 scrolls now for $28 million. So they kind of weren't very good businessmen. But all they were interested in feeding their goats. So you have to keep that in mind. It's a different world. Next slide. The original 3, this is going back to the Isaiah scroll, 1 QS, and Pesher Habakkuk, were later sold to the Archbishop Samuel for $64, still a bargain. I mean, of course, 1948 or $1949, I don't know how that would play out. Still not near anything what they are actually worth nowadays. So somebody was still getting a bargain. The difficulty with the scrolls is that no one accepted the actual antiquity of them. They thought maybe they were, from synagogues, or they were just copied by someone not too long ago. Of course, these people had no idea about paleography, where you determine the age of a text from the actual script itself. So they had no idea what they were really looking at until Eliezer Sukenik entered into the picture. Sukenik met with Samuel in Jerusalem and recognized the script on the scroll, and that it was similar to what he had seen in some first century ossuaries. So he immediately recognized that these were ancient texts, going back as early as the first century CE, probably even older, which turns out they are. So the 2 of them went to Bethlehem to meet Salahi, who was the other dealer, to see the actual scrolls. Here's Sukenik, which I'll tell you a little bit about him. He determined that these documents could be one of the greatest finds in the history of archaeology, which turned out to be very true. He approached the Syrian church, who had possession of the other scrolls, the original scrolls, with an offer to buy them along with those in possession of the archbishop, which would be the newer ones. Once he saw the interest of Sukenik, the archbishop's thinking now, the church decided to seek advice of the value of the scrolls from the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. And here's where things start to take a not so good twist. This group was headed up by John Trevor, William Brownlee, and Miller Burroughs. And bringing these 3 gentlemen into the picture created some real issues with publication of the texts, which were delayed up to probably 30 years because of the possession of the scrolls with these 3 gentlemen. and this would prove to be decisive in the future publication of the scrolls. The involvement of these three men began a process that would see the dispersion of the scrolls into various hands instead of a central organization like the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which once they got possession of them, Emmanuel Tov took over as the head editor of the publication of the scrolls and immediately began a process in the early 1990s, which resulted in the final publication of all the scrolls around 2006. Even then, it still took them, 15, 20 years to publish them properly. But because of these three gentlemen, Trevor Brownlee and Burroughs, being involved in the early days, it created quite a delay in the publication of the scrolls themselves. Back to the discovery. That's what I already did. That, sorry. So, following the war, and due to travel restrictions within Israel and Palestine, which you can imagine, due to the war, Cave 1 lay idle and was not rediscovered until January 1949. So we have approximately a 2-year delay there, a year and a half delay of getting back into the cave and looking for more scrolls. But once able to do so, the excavation of the cave was undertaken by Roland DeVoe with the authority of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. Remember, this is still in the West Bank, or considered to be in the West Bank. Unfortunately, during the period in which the cave was inaccessible to archaeologists, it had been robbed of an unknown amount of material. And it was not until 1955 that all of the original 7 scrolls from Cave 1 were brought back into the possession of the Israeli Antiquities Authority. But in the meantime, the search was on for more caves and more scrolls. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting to click. Here is the most important cave out of all the 11 at Qumran. This is Cave 4. This is an interior shot of the cave looking east towards the Dead Sea Scroll. And the cliff in the back, at the top of that cliff, is the community itself where the buildings were located. So you're looking east out of Cave 4 towards the community and towards the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea, which is on the other side of that cliff there. This cave was found in August 1952, and it contained the largest quantity of manuscript material. Pieces of some 600 documents in all were found in Cave 4, out of approximately 900 that are in the whole collection, 900 plus. 600 of them were found in Cave 4. This slide shows the interior of the cave looking east towards the Dead Sea. And then the final Qumran cave, well, at least for now, is Cave 11, which, if you were here for Dr. Spahn's presentation yesterday, he talked a little bit about this. This was discovered in 1956 and contained 31 texts, including 2 of the most important discoveries of all the Qumran material, the Great Psalm Scroll, which Dr. Spahn talked about yesterday, 11Q5, and the Temple Scroll, 11Q19, which is a scroll that talks about the activities that are going on in the Jerusalem temple and how the rituals are supposed to be undertaken. The difficulty is that whether or not this was a Qumran understanding of how the activities or the rituals were supposed to be taking place, or whether they were actually being carried out as it says in the scroll. My guess is that this is more of a polemical text written against the priesthood and the temple in Jerusalem itself. And this scroll tells us how the Qumran community thought the temple was supposed to be conducted in a reasonable, purified fashion, unlike what we believe the priesthood was doing in Jerusalem at the time. I mean, that's one of the major splits that we see why the Qumran community was established to start with. was because of its disagreement with the priesthood, in particular the high priest in Jerusalem. He's called in some of the sectarian scrolls the wicked priest. So there's a lot of discussion about who exactly that is, which we won't get into right now, but it's one of the primary reasons, temple and its purification and its purity versus what was actually going on with the priesthood in Jerusalem. So there was a lot of argument. But you can see here the exterior of Cave 11, and then this is a close-up of it. Again, this has deteriorated quite a bit since its initial discovery in 56. So most of the scrolls are fragments of much larger documents. Okay, don't imagine that these scrolls contain perfectly complete scrolls of biblical texts, because they don't. Okay, they're made up of approximately 30,000 fragments. Some of the scrolls have survived fairly well, like the Great Isaiah scroll, although at the bottom of it there's some text missing and there's a few holes along the way, but it survives pretty much intact. But the majority of them are fragments, okay? So don't think that they pulled all these jars out of the caves and, oh, look at this, let's look at this scroll. Wasn't like that. When they discovered them, they were brushing away dirt and finding little fragments, this big or this big. And then the process of putting those back together is the crazy stuff. 30,000 fragments, sorry. And there are approximately 800 to 900 different texts. I think the latest estimate is like 910 different texts amongst the Qumran library. Okay? And I'll explain what they were in a bit here. Most of them have been dated between 200 BC and the late 1st century CE, although there's a couple of the Enoch texts, one Enoch text that could be dated into the very late 4th century. So you can see some of the stuff is quite old. And we believe that's probably one of the older texts from the Qumran collection. They're written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So we have all three of the biblical languages there. Of course, if you're a Latinist, you would be complaining right now. 1/3 of the texts are copies of biblical texts. I mean, they're straight out of the Bible, like Isaiah. The only one that we don't have is Esther. Although, there was an article recently published that suggests that they have discovered a fragment of the book of Esther there now. So it may be that we have a complete Hebrew Bible at some point in Qumran's history. And then some scholars argue that there's a small fragment of Greek text of the Gospel of Mark, but this is very dubious. And although I do have a slide, if you want, we can come back and talk about it during Q&A, but the likelihood of that is, how many know the date of Mark being written? What is it? '60s, '50s, '60s, somewhere in there, CE. I guess it's possible that something could have ended up in one of the caves, but if you look at it, we can come back to it later if you want, but it's very unlikely that this is actually a fragment from the book of Mark, but a lot of people want to argue it is. The remaining 2/3 of the texts are non-biblical, but they are very religious in nature. In other words, you're talking about texts that are the religious life in the community, religious issues going on between various sects in Judaism in general. Some of the texts that we've found are previously known from the pseudepigrapha or apocrypha, such as the Book of Jubilees, 1 Enoch, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. They were only known previously in Greek or Ethiopic, but now we have some original texts from the closing centuries BC that are in Hebrew and Aramaic. So we now have another tool of investigating some of the theology or the worldview of these particular texts. Others are directly related to the Qumran community, and these are what's called the Sectarian Texts, although there's a big debate about whether or not we should call them sectarian. And this is how the community lived their lives and how they formed their worldview. And some of the more prominent sectarian texts are 1QS, which is the rule of the community, which we have a facsimile over here. The Damascus document, which is very similar to the rule of the community, but in a broader perspective. And then a very interesting document called 4QMMT, Matters of the Law. And this is evidence of the grievances that the community had with the temple priesthood in Jerusalem. And it talks in detail about some of the things that they felt the priesthood was doing wrong and how the community thought these things should and could and should be corrected with. Then we also have the War Scroll, which foretells the coming battle of the forces of darkness versus the forces of light. Very eschatological, apocalyptic, end of the world stuff. So quite a variety of literature that we have here. Other genres include commentaries, which are the Pesharim, the Habakkuk, and Isaiah, along with others. Rewritten Bible. Anybody heard that term before? Rewritten Bible is, for instance, Genesis Apocryphon. It's the author of the Genesis Apocryphon text, which again is a facsimile is on display. The author took the book of Genesis and decided he wanted to add his worldview or his theology to it, or take some of it away. So it's a contraction or an expansion of the biblical text, which is really interesting. You get a lot of conjecture about where these stories came from, and some of these same stories show up in later rabbinic writings also. So, for instance, let's look. Jubilees is considered a rewritten Bible text. It's the retelling or the rewriting of the book of Genesis and a portion of the book of Exodus. And one of the interesting bits about it, well, there's so many interesting bits about it, but one of the more interesting, the rewriting of Genesis 22, which who knows what that is? I'm looking at all these Christian high school students here. It's the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay? The book of Jubilees retells that story. Whoops. I should almost quit, right? Let me tell you this quickly. Jubilees retells the story of Genesis 22 by introducing Mastema, or the Satan character. Now, keep in mind, this is not the Christian Satan, okay? And Satan then asks God to challenge Abraham and his faith towards God, whether or not it's real. And he says, well, why don't you have him sacrifice his son, Isaac? So God says, okay, I'll go along with you. So Satan is then allowed to intervene in this situation, and the whole story of the sacrifice of Isaac, and Abraham takes him up to the mountain, and then an angel comes along and ends the whole thing. So, but anyway, there's a retelling of that where the Satan figure has a role in that, in testing and trying the faith of Abraham. And you see this figure doing this quite often in a lot of the pseudepigrapha or rewritten Bible texts that we find at Qumran, but also in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha and Apocrypha too. We find this type of rewriting of the scriptures. We also have poetry, apocalyptic texts, and other pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is a text that an ancient biblical figure is attributed as the author of this particular text, although it's quite clear that it's impossible for that person to have written the text. But in order to give the text authority in the community, for instance, Enoch is given the authorship of one Enoch, which is a very important document at Qumran. It tells about the origins of evil spirits, the relationship of angels and women and all that stuff. It goes into a lot of detail. But and some of the most interesting ones are the commentaries of the prophetic books, which are called Pesharim. And these interpret the biblical text in light of the role of the community in the eschaton. In other words, what's going on now? And how does this biblical text help us understand what's going on now? Just as we do the same thing, except we don't write Pesharim, we write essays and articles and commentaries, but not quite in the same manner as what a Pesher is. But we're looking at the biblical text and trying to figure out, how does this relate to what's going on in our Christian community today? So this is what the Essenes from Qumran were doing with the biblical text, in particular the prophetic books, because they were telling what was the word of God to the community, even if it was written in the time of Habakkuk or whether it's written in the time of the Qumran community. They understood it as God speaking to the community and what they were supposed to do in light of what the biblical text was saying. And then the author of the Pesharim was writing that out so that the whole community would know how we're supposed to live our lives and what this particular incident or episode, what do the Romans have to do with us now? Or what do the Hellenists have to do with us now? So really helpful in understanding what was going on in 1st century BC and 1st century CE Jewish worldview and theology. I think this is the last slide. So, the interesting thing is the scrolls are not really very helpful with historical events. Okay, they tell us a lot about worldview and theology and community life and their view of God and so forth, but they don't tell us a lot about what was actually going on historically, where we have other texts like Maccabees that do tell us stuff like that, or Josephus from the Second Temple period also tells us some. The greatest benefit is what they tell us about Jewish life, Jewish belief, Jewish worldview, Jewish theology. And as Christians, we're interested in how, at least my studies, my interest is how this relates to what was emerging in the early church and how we can better understand what Jesus was talking about, what Paul was talking about, what Peter was talking about in relation to what was going on in this particular sect of Judaism from the 1st century. So in that sense, they're very helpful. But historically, not so helpful. And what we see when we look at these texts is a life much more complicated in the 1st century than we imagined. We read the New Testament, and you see the Pharisees and the Sadducees and, various little zealot groups. But we don't see a very complicated picture of their views. We don't know a lot about what Pharisees thought. We don't know a lot about what Sadducees thought, except they supposedly didn't believe in angels or life after death. But when we look now at Qumran, we have a much more in-depth theology of, although it be sectarian, it is a picture of part of a picture of the broader Jewish view or Jewish worldview and Jewish theology from the 1st century, from which Christianity emerged. So in that sense, they're very, very helpful for us. And what they do show is that it was a time of power struggles, separatism, asceticism, and militancy is what is revealed, or at least verified in the scrolls. So I'll close there. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes.
In the Genesis scrolls, was there anything found there that was related to the book of Jasher?
To what? No. Nothing. Interesting question, though. But no. Not yet, anyway.
Have we ever found a book yet, or
No. That's what you would call one of the lost books of the Bible. Although apparently a source for biblical text, but we haven't found it yet. No.
Other questions?
Good question. Oh, this is easy.
Well, you do have it easy. Dr. Wright is leaving for Ethiopia today, and so we're going to let him slide out of here without asking him any hard questions.
Darn.
Unless you guys think of something.
Nobody have any hard, easy?
I want to thank. Oh, we do. Okay. Yes.
As these caves were discovered, where did the ownership of these documents? Who owned them? As I'm sure there were lots of folks looking for them. Where was the ownership, or who took possession of them?
Well, that's part of the big problem. Or initially was the Trevor, Brownlee, and Burroughs kind of took possession of them, which apparently was a mistake. But now, today, there's two groups that have them. The Israeli Antiquities Authority and the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem has them. And they are the ones who grant all rights to the documents. They have ownership of them.
But each time a cave was discovered, they were the same group of people that were looking for it and took possession.
Yeah, Roland DeVoe was the archaeologist who was over the whole, whether it's excavation of the community buildings or excavation of the caves. He was in charge, and he had the authority of the Israeli Antiquities Authority to control the dig. So under their authority, everything then became theirs. But the problem was still that Trevor, Burroughs, and what's his name, were in control of the publication of them. And that was the problem until it was wrestled away from them and given over to Emmanuel Tove and a whole group of editors. That then we had real life in the publication of the scrolls at that point, beginning in the 90s. So it took quite a while. Good question.
There was another question? Yes.
what are some parallels between the sectarian documents and things that we see in the New Testament? How do the sectarian documents illuminate some things that we find in the church?
I knew you'd ask something like that. Well, when you look at, for instance, the community rule, 1QS, which again is on display, facsimiles over there. If you look at that document in relation to the life of John the Baptist and some of the issues that we see in his life, whether it be baptism or his life of celibacy and asceticism in the wilderness, there's some direct correlation to what we have in 1QS and how the Qumran community was to live their life versus what we see John the Baptist doing in his particular life. Now, there are scholars who believe that John the Baptist had some kind of connection to Qumran, whether he was originally part of it and left and went out on his own, or perhaps he didn't quite cut the mustard to become a full member. Remember, it took 2 years, and if you messed up during those 2 years, you basically had to start over or just get out. So, but we do see some parallels in his life versus the life of the community and the rule of the community. But there are others. There's the sons of light, sons of darkness in the sectarian texts, which you hear Jesus talking about in the Gospels. Spirit of flesh versus a Holy Spirit in Paul's writings, from 1QS also, from chapters or from columns 3 and 4. So yeah, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of issues to be studied. I mean, we're just scraping the surface of the relationship between the scrolls and New Testament theology. But there's a lot of stuff there that's very helpful in our understanding of what Paul was talking about when it comes to the spirit versus the flesh in relation to what we see in Qumran. But then also you have this eschatological thing going on with the sons of light and sons of darkness that Jesus is talking about in the Gospels. But then in the War Scroll, we have the same language of the sons of light being those that are within the community of Qumran, and the sons of darkness are those outside. They could be Jews, they could be pagans, they could be anything. But there's this war going to happen between the sons of light, those who are in community with God, and those who are outside of that community. So it's very much helpful in his understanding of Revelation or even some of Paul's writings too. So good question.
Yes.
Just a quick question as far as historical context. I know it's not entirely verified that it was the Essenes in the Qumran community. Given your own research, what is your opinion as far as whether it was?
I think it probably was. But the Essenes were not, they were not only at Qumran. Okay? Although it's believed they were there, but it's believed there were Essene communities scattered throughout the Middle East, or what we call the Middle East. And it's from those other communities that some of these external documents came into the Library of Qumran that probably weren't written there, but became part of their collection. And very much like 1 Enoch is likely not from Qumran. It's likely written outside of Qumran, probably by Essenes, but we don't know for sure. But yeah, the Essenes were kind of scattered in communities around the land, but it's believed that the actual Qumran community was made up of Essenes. That's what I would think.
Last question.
Is there anything found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that challenges the Christian faith?
No. That's been a question that's been asked often and continues to be asked, but no. I mean, the talk of the Messiah in the scrolls is very much in line with what we see in Christian expectations, or I guess Jews that would become Christians' expectations of the Messiah. So, no, there's really nothing that would contradict what we see in Christianity. Good question.
Not really a question, but along those lines, isn't it more the Dead Sea Scrolls, because even liberals agree they were written 200 years before Christ, that, at least, that it actually proves out that the Bible is the Word of God because of the prophecy, and, they have trouble because they do have to agree that, they were written before Christ was born. So, in fact,
They do, to a degree, witness what we see in the Gospels about the Messiah. Yes, very much so. Good question or
Thank
comment.
you for those great questions and comments. I also want to thank you all for being our guests.